What if everything you've been told about the ancient gods is wrong? What if the beings our ancestors worshipped were not divine at all, but something else entirely? And what if they didn't leave by choice, but were forced to abandon this planet after a catastrophe so vast, so violent, that even their advanced technology could not save them? Imagine it. A world where gods walked among humans, and then vanished, leaving behind only silence. Welcome. Before we go any further, take a moment to relax. Let your mind slow down. This is not just a story. It's a journey into the deepest layers of our forgotten past. And if you enjoy exploring mysteries like this, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. It helps the channel continue uncovering stories others are afraid to touch. Now, let's begin. Thousands of years ago, in the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, something extraordinary happened. A civilization appeared. Not gradually, not through slow development, but suddenly, fully formed, complex, advanced. We call them the Sumerians. According to conventional history, they were the first true civilization on Earth. They built cities, created writing, developed mathematics, law, astronomy, and irrigation systems that transformed barren land into fertile ground. They laid the foundation for everything we now call civilization. But there's a problem. They shouldn't have existed, at least not like that. Because when archaeologists study early human development, they expect to see a progression. Simple tools evolving into complex ones, primitive societies gradually becoming advanced. But with the Sumerians, that progression is missing. They appear as if someone turned on the lights, fully equipped with knowledge that should have taken thousands of years to develop. Even more intriguing is what the Sumerians themselves said. They never claimed to have invented their knowledge. Instead, they wrote something else, over and over again, on thousands of clay tablets that still exist today. They said their knowledge was given to them. Given by beings who came from the sky. They called them the Anunnaki, the ones who from heaven to earth came. These were not distant gods watching from above. According to the texts, they walked among humans. They ruled cities. They gave laws. They taught writing, science, and architecture. They were not myths to the Sumerians. They were rulers. But if these beings were real, if they truly shaped the earliest human civilization, then one question becomes unavoidable. Where did they go? Because at some point in history, they vanished. Not gradually, not quietly, but completely, leaving behind ruins, fragmented stories, and a mystery that has never been fully explained. And according to the same ancient texts, their departure was not a peaceful one. To understand what really happened, we need to look closer at the Sumerians themselves. Not just what they built, but how they appeared. Because everything about them breaks the expected pattern of human history. Their cities were not simple settlements. They were organized, structured, and engineered with precision. Uruk, Ur, Eridu. These were not primitive villages. They had walls, temples, administrative systems, and social hierarchies. They had priests, scribes, and rulers who governed with written laws. Writing itself, the foundation of recorded history, did not evolve slowly here. It appeared. Cuneiform, their system of writing, emerged already complex. capable of recording trade, law, mythology, and mathematics. Thousands of symbols, used with consistency and purpose. But writing is not something that simply appears overnight. It requires development, trial and error, generations of refinement. Yet no earlier versions have been found that clearly lead to it. It's as if the Sumerians were taught. The same pattern repeats in their knowledge of astronomy. They understood planetary movements with remarkable accuracy. They tracked celestial cycles, mapped the stars, and described the heavens in ways that suggest observation far beyond what primitive tools should allow. They knew about planets invisible to the naked eye. They described the structure of the solar system with a level of detail that raises uncomfortable questions even today. How could a civilization, newly emerged, possess such knowledge? And perhaps even more unsettling, why did they insist they did not discover it themselves? Over and over, across tablets and inscriptions, they repeated the same idea. Their knowledge came from the gods, not metaphorical gods, not symbolic forces, but beings with names, roles, hierarchies, beings who governed, who made decisions, who intervened. The Sumerians described a structured pantheon, led by powerful figures such as Anu, Enlil, and Enki. These were not distant creators hidden in the sky. They were administrators of Earth itself, each responsible for different domains: air, water, land, knowledge. And beneath them, others. A group collectively known as the Anunnaki. According to the texts, they were not born on Earth. They came from somewhere else, a place referred to as Nibiru, a distant world, moving in a long and mysterious orbit. And their arrival on Earth was not random. It had a purpose, a mission, one that would change the fate of this planet forever. Because the Anunnaki did not come here to observe. They came to extract something. Something hidden beneath the surface of this world. Something so valuable that it justified crossing the vast distances between stars. And that something was gold. Gold. At first it sounds almost disappointing. Something so ordinary. Something we use for jewelry, electronics, decoration. But to the Anunnaki, according to the Sumerian texts, gold was not about wealth. It was survival. Their world, Nibiru, was described as a planet far from the sun. Cold, harsh, vulnerable. Its atmosphere was failing, slowly collapsing, exposing the surface to the emptiness of space. They needed a solution. And the solution, they believed, was gold. Not in solid form, not as objects or ornaments, but as microscopic particles, dispersed into the atmosphere to reflect radiation and preserve heat. A protective shield, created from dust. Today, this idea might sound futuristic, but modern science has already begun exploring something very similar. Geoengineering, using reflective particles in the atmosphere to regulate planetary temperature. A controversial concept, but one taken seriously at the highest levels. The Sumerians described this thousands of years ago. So the Anunnaki came to Earth, not to rule, not to worship, but to mine, to extract gold from deep within the planet. At first, they did the work themselves. The texts speak of lower gods, workers sent into the mines, tasked with labor so exhausting, so relentless, that even they began to break under its weight. These were not symbolic struggles. The descriptions are physical, specific, repetitive, digging, carrying, extracting, until something changed. The workers rebelled. They refused to continue. They surrounded the dwellings of their leaders, demanding relief, demanding an end to their suffering. And for the first time, the rulers of Earth faced a problem they could not ignore. They needed labor, but they could no longer rely on their own kind. So a decision was made, a decision that would alter the future of this planet forever. One of the leading figures among them, Enki, often described as the god of wisdom and creation, proposed a solution. Not a temporary fix, not a new system, but something far more radical. He suggested creating a new species, a being that would be intelligent enough to follow instructions, but simple enough to obey. A workforce designed, engineered, controlled. The texts describe this moment not as myth, but as process. Trials, failures, adjustments, attempts that did not survive, forms that were incomplete, unstable, until finally, something worked. A being that could live, reproduce, serve. According to the Sumerians, that being was us. Humanity wasn't discovered. It was created. Not through evolution alone, but through intervention. A merging of something from them and something from Earth. And if that is true, then the question is no longer just where we came from, but why we were made in the first place. The Sumerian texts do not describe creation as a miracle. They describe it as work, careful, repeated, imperfect. They speak of a place often translated as the house of creation, a controlled environment where experiments were conducted, where life was not born naturally, but assembled. Enki, the architect of the plan, did not work alone. He was joined by Ninhursag, sometimes called the Mother Goddess, the one responsible for shaping life itself. Together, they carried out a process that sounds disturbingly familiar. They took something from themselves and combined it with something from the earth. The texts described the essence of a young god being mixed with clay, a symbolic phrase perhaps, or perhaps something more literal, something closer to what we would now call genetic material. DNA, the instructions for life. But the process did not succeed immediately. There were failures, many of them. The tablets speak of beings that could not survive, forms that were unstable, creatures that could not reproduce, or that were physically incomplete. They were discarded, refined, tried again, over and over, until finally, something changed. A being emerged that could live, that could function, that could follow commands. The first true human. In some texts, he's called a Dappa. In others, the first man, a prototype. But even then, the work was not finished. Because creating one being is not enough. To build a workforce, you need reproduction. And so, the next stage began. The ability to multiply, to pass on genetic information, to sustain a population. The texts describe this as a breakthrough, a moment when the created beings were no longer dependent on their makers to exist. They could now replace themselves. And with that, humanity became a system, self-sustaining, expanding, controlled, but alive. And for a time, it worked. Humans were placed into the role they had been designed for. They labored. They built. They served, and the Anunnaki ruled. But something unexpected began to happen. Something the creators may not have fully anticipated. Humans were not just functional. They were aware. They observed. They learned. They adapted. And slowly, they began to understand more than they were supposed to. According to some interpretations of the texts, Enki himself may have encouraged this. He is often portrayed as sympathetic toward humanity, as someone who saw potential in his creation, not just as workers, but as something more. Something capable of growth, knowledge, independence. But not all of the Anunnaki agreed. Enlil, another powerful figure, is described very differently. Strict, controlling, concerned that humans were becoming too advanced, too numerous, too unpredictable. And that concern would eventually lead to a decision. A decision that would not only change humanity, but would set in motion the beginning of the end. For a time, the system held. The Anunnaki ruled from above. Humans worked below. Cities grew, fields expanded. Temples rose toward the sky, not just as places of worship, but as points of connection between the two worlds, between those who served and those who were served. This was the age the Sumerians described as the time when kingship descended from heaven, not metaphorically, literally. Because according to their records, the first rulers of Earth were not human. They were the Anunnaki themselves. They governed cities, assigned roles, established order. Each region had its overseer, each function its authority. It was not chaos. It was structure. Precise, organized, efficient. Humans in this system had a purpose. They were farmers, builders, laborers. They maintained the land, supported the infrastructure, provided what the gods required. And in return, they were given knowledge, agriculture, construction, basic astronomy. Enough to sustain the system, but not enough to challenge it. Or at least, that was the intention. Because something continued to shift. Human populations began to grow, faster than expected. Settlements expanded into cities. Cities into networks. Communication improved. Cooperation increased. And with it, awareness. Humans were no longer just following instructions. They were observing patterns, learning independently, passing knowledge to one another, not just what they were taught, but what they discovered. And slowly, the balance began to change. The texts describe a growing tension, not a sudden conflict, but a gradual unease. Among the Anunnaki, opinions began to divide. Some, like Enki, saw this development as natural, even inevitable. He viewed humanity not just as a tool, but as a creation with potential. Something that could evolve beyond its original purpose. Something that could one day stand on its own. Others did not share this view. Enlil, in particular, is described as deeply concerned. To him, humans were becoming too many, too noisy, too unpredictable. Their presence was no longer just functional, it was disruptive. The texts use an interesting phrase. They say humanity had become too loud, not just in sound, but in existence. Their growth, their activity, their expansion. It was overwhelming the system that had been designed to control them. And with that, a decision began to form. Not immediately, not without debate, but steadily. The idea that something had to be done. something final. Because from the perspective of those who wanted control, there were only two options left. Either humanity would be limited, or it would become something uncontrollable. And according to the ancient texts, a council was called, a gathering of the highest powers, to decide the fate of the human race. The council was not a myth, at least, not in the way we usually understand myths. The Sumerian tablets describe it as a gathering of power, a moment where the highest-ranking Anunnaki came together to make a decision that would affect not just themselves, but the entire planet. This was not a discussion about governance, not about resources, not even about control. This was about survival, because by this point, something else had entered the equation. Something far beyond human growth, far beyond internal conflict. The signs had already begun, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But to those who watched the sky, impossible to ignore. The Anunnaki, according to the texts, were not only rulers of Earth, they were observers of the heavens. They tracked movements of celestial bodies. They understood cycles that spanned thousands of years. They followed patterns invisible to human perception. And what they saw was a warning. Something was approaching. Not a single object, but a sequence of events. A chain reaction, already in motion. The texts describe disturbances in the sky, changes in light, irregularities in the movement of stars, a growing instability that suggested something massive was shifting within the system. And at the center of it all was Nibiru, their home. Its orbit was not like the planets we know. It moved in a long, extended path, taking thousands of years to complete a single cycle. And during certain periods, it would pass closer to the inner solar system, closer to Earth. But this time, something was different. The alignment was not stable. The gravitational interactions were stronger, more chaotic, and worse. It was not alone. Fragments, debris, objects moving alongside it, the remnants of something broken, perhaps a collision that had occurred long before, or something that was about to happen. The Anunnaki understood the implications immediately. This was not a passing event. This was a threat, a real one, not something they could simply observe, something they would have to survive. The council, as described in the texts, became divided almost instantly. Some argued that humanity should be warned, that preparations should begin, that shelters, systems, protections should be built, that the beings they had created should be given a chance. Others disagreed, strongly. Enlil, once again, stood at the center of that opposition. His argument was simple. Humans were not ready. They were unstable, too emotional, too reactive. Giving them knowledge of what was coming would not save them, would create chaos, panic, collapse. And worse, it might give them time to resist, to question, to rise beyond their role, to become something uncontrollable. So the choice was reframed, not as a question of morality, but as a calculation. What outcome would preserve the order that had been built? What outcome would ensure that whatever survived could still be controlled? And slowly, the decision began to take shape. The Anunnaki would not intervene, not directly. They would not warn humanity. They would not prevent what was coming. Instead, they would prepare for themselves, secure their own survival, and allow the event to unfold. A reset, natural selection, on a planetary scale. But not all of them agreed, because one of them refused to stay silent. And that choice would change everything. Enki did not argue loudly. He did not challenge the council with force. He did something far more dangerous. He acted. The decision had been made. The Anunnaki would withdraw. They would prepare their vessels, secure their technology, and wait for the event to pass from a distance, far above the surface of the Earth. Humanity was not part of that plan, but Enki had spent too much time observing them, studying them, understanding them. He had seen something the others chose to ignore. Not just obedience, not just utility, but potential. And so, instead of confronting the council directly, he found another way. The texts describe this moment in a strange and symbolic form. They say he spoke to a wall, not to a person, not directly, but through it. A message delivered without technically breaking the command. A warning hidden in plain sight. The man who received it was named Utnapishtim, a human, but not just any human. He was observant, capable, trusted, the kind of individual who could follow complex instructions without questioning them too early. Enki chose him carefully, because what he was about to reveal could not be misunderstood. The instructions were precise. Build a vessel, not a boat in the simple sense, something larger, sealed, structured, capable of surviving not just water, but chaos. The texts describe dimensions, materials, methods. It reads less like a myth and more like a blueprint. Utnapishtim followed the instructions, quietly, without drawing attention. While the world around him continued as it always had, people worked, cities functioned. Nothing seemed different, but above them, everything was changing, because the signs were no longer subtle. They were undeniable. The sky itself began to shift. There are descriptions, fragmented, scattered across cultures, of what happened next. Lights in the sky, objects moving in unnatural patterns, a growing brightness, followed by darkness. And then, impact. Not one. Many. The current scientific term for this event is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. But the ancient texts describe it in a way that feels far more immediate, far more violent. Fragments of a comet or asteroid entered the atmosphere, breaking apart, multiplying, turning the sky into a storm of fire. The northern regions of the planet were hit first. Massive ice sheets, kilometers thick, covered large parts of what we now call North America. When the impact struck, those ice sheets did not simply crack. They exploded, vaporized. Trillions of tons of water were released almost instantly. Flooding began, not as rising rivers, but as walls of water. Tsunamis that crossed continents. Waves that erased entire landscapes in hours. At the same time, heat. Extreme heat. The impacts ignited forests across the hemisphere. The air filled with ash, smoke, and debris. The sky darkened. Sunlight disappeared. And then came the cold. A sudden, brutal drop in temperature. Not over centuries, not even over generations, but within decades. The planet entered what scientists now call an impact winter. A period where sunlight was blocked, temperatures fell, and ecosystems collapsed. Animals that had survived ice ages for thousands of years disappeared. Mammoths, giant sloths, predators at the top of the food chain, gone, Almost simultaneously, human populations were reduced, scattered, pushed to the edge of survival, and above it all, according to the Sumerian accounts, the Anunnaki watched, from their vessels, from the sky, not intervening, not stopping it, because they couldn't, or because they chose not to. The texts describe even them as afraid. They are said to have gathered together in the heavens, watching the destruction below, witnessing the collapse of everything they had built. There is a line, simple but revealing. It says the gods cowered like dogs, not rulers, not creators, but observers, facing something beyond their control. And on the surface of the earth, only a few survived. Among them, the one who had been warned, Utnapishtim, inside the vessel, waiting for the world to end. Inside the vessel, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that follows chaos. Heavy, uncertain. Utnapishtim and those with him could not see the full extent of what was happening outside. The structure was sealed, just as instructed, built to endure pressure, impact, and movement. And movement there was. The texts describe it not as floating calmly, but as being thrown, lifted, dropped, carried by forces too large to comprehend. Water surged in every direction. Waves collided, merged, rose again. The vessel was no longer navigating. It was surviving. Time. Lost meaning. There was no day. No night. Only darkness. The sky, once filled with fire, had turned into a thick veil of ash and vapor. Sunlight could not pass through. The world outside had become unrecognizable. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into something longer. No one inside could be sure. And above it all, the Anunnaki remained in the sky. But something had changed. They were no longer in control. Their cities, gone. Their minds, flooded. Their infrastructure, erased. Everything they had built over thousands of years had vanished in a matter of moments. The texts describe a moment after the worst had passed, when the waters began to settle, when the clouds started to thin, when visibility returned, just enough to see what remained. And what remained was almost nothing. Land had shifted. Coastlines had disappeared. Entire regions had been reshaped. What was once fertile had become barren. What was once structured had become chaotic. And even for the Anunnaki, this was not the world they had known. They descended. Carefully, not all at once, but in stages. Assessing, observing, trying to understand the damage. And what they found was worse than expected. Because the catastrophe had not ended with impact and flood. It had changed the system itself. The climate was unstable. Temperatures fluctuated unpredictably. Seasons no longer followed familiar patterns. The balance that had allowed agriculture, planning, and long-term stability was gone. And with it, their purpose. Gold, the resource they had come for, was now harder to access. Buried deeper. Scattered. The processes they relied on no longer functioned the same way. And humanity, what remained of it, was different. Traumatized. Reduced, but not erased. Utnapishtim's vessel eventually came to rest on high ground. According to the texts, a mountain. He waited until the waters receded enough to step outside, to see the world again, to confirm what had survived. He released birds. One did not return. Land had emerged. Life had begun again. And when he finally stepped out, the Anunnaki came, drawn, not by him, but by something else. The texts describe it in a strangely human way. They say the gods gathered because of the smell of food, of offerings, of life returning. They had not eaten, not in the way they once did, because the system that sustained them had collapsed. No humans, no rituals, no supply. For the first time, they felt absence, dependence, and that realization changed everything, because it meant something they had not fully acknowledged before. They needed humanity, just as much as humanity had once needed them. But the world they stood on now was broken, and what came next would not be a restoration. It would be a struggle. What followed the catastrophe was not peace. It was not recovery. It was instability for both sides. The Earth had changed, and with it, the balance that once existed between the Anunnaki and humanity. The survivors began to rebuild, slowly, carefully. They gathered what remained, found higher ground, relearned how to grow food in a world where the seasons no longer behaved the way they once had. Knowledge had been lost, not completely, but enough to force humanity back into a fragile state. And the Anunnaki, they faced a different kind of problem, not survival, but control. Because the system they had designed was broken. Humanity was no longer centralized, no longer predictable. Groups were scattered across the planet, disconnected, isolated, adapting in their own ways. And worse, they remembered, not clearly, not in detail, but in fragments. Stories of fire from the sky, of water swallowing the land, of beings who had warned some and abandoned others. That memory mattered because it changed perception. Humans no longer saw the Anunnaki only as rulers, but as something more complex, something uncertain. And uncertainty is the beginning of resistance. Among the Anunnaki, tensions rose again. This time, not about whether to warn humanity, but about what to do with it now. Some believed the opportunity had come. Humanity was weakened, reduced, easier to control again. They could rebuild the system, restart the process, return to what had worked before. Others disagreed, because the world itself was no longer stable enough to support that system. Resources were inconsistent, climate unpredictable, infrastructure gone. Rebuilding would take time they might not have. And then, there were those who saw a different path entirely. Leave, not immediately, but eventually. Because Earth was no longer what it had been, not the controlled environment they had shaped over thousands of years, but something volatile, uncertain, risky. Still, that was not the only conflict. There is another layer described in the texts, one that is often overlooked: the use of weapons, not during the initial catastrophe, but after. In the struggle that followed, the Sumerian records speak of destruction. That does not match natural events. Cities erased, not by water, not by time, but by force. There are descriptions of light so intense it blinded, heat so powerful it turned materials into something else entirely. Wind that carried death long after the moment of impact. The language is ancient, symbolic, but the patterns are familiar. Some researchers have compared these descriptions to something modern, something we understand. Radiation, explosive energy, weapons, beyond conventional means. The texts mention specific locations, regions near what we now know as the Middle East, areas where, even today, there are anomalies, unusual patterns in the land, signs of extreme heat, materials that appear altered. The official explanations vary. Meteor impacts, natural events, unusual geology, but none of them fully account for the descriptions found in the ancient texts. And if those descriptions are accurate, then the Anunnaki did not just witness the destruction of Earth, they contributed to it, not as a unified force, but as factions, disagreeing, acting independently, using power in ways that had consequences that made the planet even less stable, even less suitable for their continued presence. And after that, something shifted permanently, not just in the world, but in their decision. Because at some point, the question was no longer how to fix what had been broken, but whether it could be fixed at all. At some point, the decision was no longer debated. It became inevitable. The Earth was still there. Life was still possible. Humans were rebuilding. But for the Anunnaki, the conditions that once made this planet valuable were gone. Their systems had collapsed. Their control had weakened. Their technology had limits. And perhaps most importantly, their time here had an end. The texts do not describe a single moment when all of them left. There was no final announcement, no unified departure. Instead, it happened gradually, quietly, one group at a time. Some remained longer than others, trying to restore what they could, re-establishing cities, teaching humans again, writing, agriculture, structure, not as rulers in the same sense as before, but as guides, observers, advisors. This is the period where the lines between gods and humans begin to blur, where kings are described as chosen by the gods, rather than being gods themselves, where divine presence becomes less direct, less physical. The Anunnaki were still there, but not everywhere. And not for long, because with each passing generation, there were fewer of them. Their appearances became rarer, their influence more distant, until eventually, something changed completely. They stopped appearing at all. The temples remained, the rituals continued. But the beings those rituals were meant for were no longer present. And so, humanity did what it always does. It adapted. The memory of the Anunnaki did not disappear immediately. It transformed. From direct experience into story. From story into myth. From myth into belief. Names changed. Roles shifted. Cultures reinterpreted what had once been real interactions. And over time, the Anunnaki became gods. Not rulers who walked among people, but distant symbolic figures, existing in the sky, in stories, in faith. And yet, the traces never fully vanished, because they had left things behind. Structures that could not be easily explained. Knowledge that seemed too advanced for its time. Patterns in architecture, astronomy, mathematics, repeating across civilizations that had no known connection. And something else. Something much closer. Within us. Because if the texts are to be taken seriously, humanity was not just influenced by them, it was shaped by them. On a level deeper than culture, deeper than knowledge, at the level of biology. Our DNA, modern science has identified sequences within the human genome that remain difficult to explain. Segments that do not match expected evolutionary pathways. Structures that appear suddenly rather than gradually. Changes that occurred too quickly to fit within standard models. One of the most discussed examples is the human chromosome 2. Unlike other primates, which have 48 chromosomes, humans have 46. At some point in the past, 2 chromosomes fused into one, not over millions of years, but in a way that appears sudden, deliberate, as if something intervened. Science offers explanations, natural mutation, genetic processes, but the precision of the fusion raises questions, questions that align uncomfortably well with the ancient descriptions of a species modified, adjusted, designed. And if that is true, then the Anunnaki did not just leave behind structures or knowledge. They left behind themselves, encoded within us. But that leads to a final question, one that the ancient texts do not answer clearly. Did they leave forever? Or was their departure only temporary? The Sumerian texts never end with certainty. They do not say, "This is how it ends." They say something far more unsettling. They suggest it never truly ended at all. Because according to those same records, the Anunnaki did not simply abandon Earth and disappear into nothing. They left with intention, with a plan, with the understanding that what they started here would continue without them. Humanity would grow, develop, evolve. Not just biologically, but mentally, socially, technologically. And one day, it would reach a point, a threshold, where it could be observed again, evaluated, perhaps even judged. The texts speak of cycles, long ones, far beyond a single human lifetime, far beyond even recorded history. Cycles tied to the movement of their home world, Nibiru, a planet described as moving in a vast, elongated orbit, returning only once every few thousand years. When it draws near, the distance between worlds becomes smaller. Travel becomes possible again. Communication easier. Contact inevitable. Modern astronomy does not officially confirm such a planet, but it also has not completely ruled it out. There are anomalies, irregularities in the outer solar system, objects that move in ways that suggest something unseen is influencing them. Some scientists call it Planet 9, an invisible mass. Far away, cold, dark, but real, enough to affect everything around it. And if such a body exists, if it follows a long orbit, then one possibility begins to form. A quiet one, a distant one, but persistent. That what the Sumerians described may not have been entirely symbolic. That something may still be out there, moving, returning, slowly. And that raises a question, not about the past, but about the future. If the Anunnaki did leave with the intention of coming back, what would they find? A civilization that has grown beyond its origins? Or one still struggling with the same patterns? Conflict, greed, division, destruction. Because in the time since their departure, humanity has achieved things that once seemed impossible. We have split the atom, mapped the genome, left the planet, sent machines beyond the edges of our solar system. We have built systems of communication that connect billions of people instantly. We have created power, immense power. But power alone does not define readiness. Because alongside that progress, the same patterns remain. War, instability, fear, the same traits that once made us controllable, still exist. And if someone were watching, if someone had created this system, and then stepped away to see what it would become, what conclusion would they reach? Would they see success or failure? The texts do not answer that. They only leave a suggestion, a possibility, that the story is not finished, that what we call ancient history may only be the beginning of something much larger. And perhaps the reason those beings left was not just because they had to, but because they wanted to see what we would become without them. So now, as you let your mind drift, consider this, not as a fact, not as a certainty, but as a thought, a quiet one, carried through time. If we were created, if something shaped us, guided us, then maybe the real question is not where they went, but what they are waiting for. Because somewhere, far beyond what we can see, something may still be moving, slowly, patiently, on a path that leads back here. And if that moment ever comes, the question will no longer be about them. It will be about us, whether we are ready or not. Now, rest. Let the thoughts settle. Let the questions fade into the background. Because for now, the sky is quiet, and whatever once watched from above remains silent.